The hull breach alarm was screaming in 3 different languages, which Varek found unnecessarily dramatic considering he was already aware the ship was dying. The cargo hauler, Lucky Sevens, named in a fit of optimism he now deeply regretted, shuddered violently as another solar flare rippled across its failing shields. Through the cracked viewport, the forbidden moon loomed larger, its obsidian surface glittering like broken glass under the bloated red sun. "Come on, you garbage heap," Varek muttered, wrestling with controls that responded with all the enthusiasm of a dead fish. "Just get me to the surface. You can explode after that, I'm flexible." The navigation system had given up entirely somewhere around the 3rd magnetic surge, leaving him to eyeball a landing trajectory, while the ship's AI helpfully informed him that his survival probability was now at 4%. Varek had long ago disabled the AI's voice module because listening to cheerful calculations of his imminent death had gotten old fast. The moon's defense satellites, ancient things that should have vaporized him on approach, remained dark and silent. Either they'd been offline for centuries, or they were saving ammunition for something more important than a 2-bit smuggler in a ship held together by profanity and prayer. Varek chose to view this as a positive sign, though his track record with positive thinking was admittedly poor. The descent became less of a landing and more of a controlled catastrophe. Mountains of black stone rushed up to meet him, their peaks sharp as broken teeth. Then the ruins appeared, massive structures that spiraled upward in impossible geometries, catching the red sunlight like frozen flame. Varek had perhaps 2 seconds to appreciate their beauty before the Lucky Sevens introduced itself to the moon's surface at a speed that would have killed him if the crash webbing hadn't deployed. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Metal shrieked, something important exploded in the engine compartment. Then silence, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and Varek's labored breathing. 4%, he wheezed at the dead console. "Told you I was lucky." Crawling from the wreckage proved his rib was either broken or deeply offended by recent events. The ship had carved a smoking trench through what looked like a courtyard, scattering chunks of black stone and fusing sand into glass. The structures around him rose like the bones of dead giants, their surfaces covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, not painfully, but in a way that made his eyes want to slide away, as if they were reading something not meant for human perception. The air tasted strange, metallic, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. That's when he saw her. She stood in the shadow of a towering archway, so still he might have missed her entirely if not for her hair, gold that caught the light like molten metal. As she stepped forward, Varek's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm before his brain caught up with his eyes. She wore simple clothing, something between a robe and a jumpsuit, in fabric that seemed to shift color with her movement. Her skin bore a faint luminescence in the crimson light, and her ears rose to delicate points that marked her as decidedly not human. "You crashed," she observed, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place, musical but with hard edges beneath the melody. "Your powers of observation are terrifying," Varek replied, then immediately regretted his tone. Here he was, stranded on a forbidden moon with a broken rib and a dead ship, antagonizing the only person around. "Stellar work, Cain. Sorry." "Yes, crashed. Solar flare took out my systems. I don't suppose you have a comm relay I could borrow. Maybe some painkillers and a small miracle." She tilted her head, studying him with eyes that reflected the red sunlight in unsettling ways. "The storms are coming. Your ship won't survive them. You won't survive them outside." As if summoned by her words, the horizon began to shimmer. Auroras rippled across the sky in colors that shouldn't exist, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with gathering charge. "The temple has shelter," she continued, gesturing toward the archway behind her. "I'm Lyraen, caretaker here. Varek Cain, professional disaster." He tried to straighten and gasped as his rib reminded him why that was a terrible idea. "Caretaker of what, exactly? This place looks like it's been dead for 1,000 years." Longer, she said and smiled. It transformed her face completely, adding warmth to features that had been almost alien in their stillness. Come. We can discuss the age of ruins, after you're not bleeding internally. I'm bleeding internally. Your body language suggests fractured ribs, possible pneumothorax. You're also favoring your left leg. Varek looked down. His left knee was indeed swelling impressively. Adrenaline's a hell of a thing. He took a step and nearly fell. Lyraen moved with startling speed, catching him with a strength that belied her slender frame. Lean on me, she said simply. This is humiliating. Would you prefer dignity or survival? When you put it that way. He leaned into her support, and together they began the slow walk toward the temple. The markings on the walls seemed to pulse as they passed, and Varek swore he could hear something like music in the charged air. So, do you get many crashers here, or am I special? You're the first visitor in 3 months, Lyraen said, and the first human I've encountered in over a year. Lucky you, we're delightful company. We bring chaos and inappropriate questions wherever we go. She laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the ancient corridors. Behind them, the sky erupted in electromagnetic fury, and the storms began their deadly dance. The temple's interior made no sense from an engineering perspective, which bothered Varek more than he cared to admit. The walls curved at angles that shouldn't be structurally sound, and the lighting seemed to emanate from the stone itself rather than any visible source. Lyraen had settled him in a chamber that might have been a meditation room or possibly a weapons storage facility. The carvings offered no helpful context. This is going to hurt, she said, holding a device that looked like a tuning fork had mated with a medical scanner. Everything already hurts. At this point, I'm just collecting injuries like trading cards. She pressed the device against his ribs, and it hummed with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Light pulsed beneath his skin, warm and intrusive. Varek watched in queasy fascination as the swelling in his chest visibly decreased. That's deeply unsettling, he said. Also, thank you. The technology predates most stellar civilizations, Lyraen explained, setting the device aside. My people preserved what we could when we found these ruins. Some of it still functions. Your people have excellent taste in haunted real estate. Varek flexed carefully, surprised to find breathing no longer felt like being stabbed. So what brings a caretaker to the most isolated moon in charted space? Did you lose a bet? Something flickered across her face, too quick to read, but it carried weight. I needed distance from my previous life. This place offered it. Running from something or toward something. Both, neither. She moved to a wall that rippled at her touch, revealing what looked like a window onto deep space. Stars wheeled past in impossible clarity. Sometimes the distinction doesn't matter. Outside, the iron storm painted the sky in violent shades of purple and green. Lightning arced between the ruins, each strike accompanied by thunder that Varek felt in his bones. The temple thrummed with each impact, absorbing the energy in ways that suggested purpose rather than mere resilience. We'll be here for several days, Lyraen said. The storms follow a pattern. 3 days of bombardment, then 12 hours of relative calm before the next cycle. Cozy. You have any food in this ancient monument to mysterious purposes? She smiled that transforming smile again. I have supplies. Nothing exotic but adequate. Adequate sounds like paradise right now. My last meal was protein paste that tasted like regret and poor life choices. The meal she produced was simple. Some kind of preserved fruit that tasted faintly of citrus, and something else he couldn't identify, along with water so pure it almost hurt to drink. They ate in the chamber with the star window, and Varek found himself talking more than he'd intended. He told her about the cargo run that had gone wrong, embellishing it into a comedy of errors involving 3 rival smuggling crews, a shipment of mood-altering fungi, and a customs inspector with no sense of humor. So there I am, he said, gesturing with a piece of fruit, explaining to this bureaucrat why my manifest lists decorative moss. when we're clearly all experiencing mild hallucinations, and my co-pilot starts arguing with a bulkhead about maritime law. Maritime in space. Lyraen laughed hard enough that she had to set down her water. What happened? Paid a massive bribe and got out before things got weirder. Lost half my profit margin, but kept my license. Mostly because the inspector was also starting to see colors that don't exist and wanted us gone before anyone noticed. You enjoy this life, the constant danger and moral ambiguity. Enjoy is strong. It's honest work in a dishonest sort of way. I'm not hurting anyone who doesn't deserve it mostly, and I'm not enforcing someone else's idea of order. He paused. That came out more philosophical than intended. Your turn. What does a caretaker do all day in a temple with no visitors? I maintain the systems, study the star maps, think about decisions I can't unmake. She touched the golden markings on her forearm absently. Sometimes I stand on the balcony and watch the storms. They're beautiful in their violence. Sounds lonely. It is, but loneliness was the point. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel past. Varek noticed she'd given him the larger portion of food, and when he mentioned it, she waved away his concern. If you keep feeding me like this, people will think you're my wife, he said without thinking. Lyraen's eyes widened, then she burst into laughter. In my culture, shared sustenance is indeed a bond, though usually there's more ceremony involved, and considerably less crash landing. I'll try to arrange better circumstances for my next proposal. Please do, I have standards. The storm intensified outside, and somewhere deep in the temple, something resonated in response. The sound was less heard than felt, like the universe itself was breathing. Your people built this? Varek asked. No, we found it, studied it, failed to understand even a fraction of its purpose. She stood, moving to touch the wall beside the window. The stars shifted, zooming impossibly close to a nebula that glowed like spilled wine. But we learned enough to know that whoever created these temples saw the cosmos differently than we do. They understood gravity as language and stars as living things. That's either profound or completely insane. Often the same thing, she said softly, and in her reflection on the window, Varek saw that expression again. The weight of something she wouldn't name, pressing down on shoulders that seemed too delicate to bear it. The storms had cleared enough for Varek to assess the damage to his ship, and the news was exactly as bad as he'd expected. The quantum drive was slag. The hull had more holes than a politician's promise, and something had nested in the port thruster. He wasn't sure what, but it had left behind a substance that his scanner refused to classify beyond, organic and probably hostile. Well, she's dead, he announced, crawling out from beneath the wreckage. I'll need parts I don't have, tools that don't exist anymore, and approximately 6 months of labor. Lyraen knelt beside the exposed engine compartment, studying it with an intensity that seemed odd for a temple caretaker. The plasma distributor is intact. If we bypass the secondary coupling and reroute through the tertiary manifold, you could achieve minimal thrust. Varek stared at her. That's extremely specific knowledge for someone who maintains ancient ruins. I read manuals when I'm bored, lots of manuals. She didn't meet his eyes. Your fuel cells are damaged but rechargeable. The temple has power generation far beyond its needs. Convenient and suspicious, but I'm not in a position to be picky. He grabbed a wrench from his salvaged toolkit. How do you feel about playing mechanic? I promise it's less boring than reading manuals. They worked through the afternoon, and Varek found himself impressed by her intuitive understanding of systems that should have been foreign to her. She anticipated his needs, handed him tools before he asked, and diagnosed problems with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years in engine rooms rather than temples. So, he said, elbow-deep in a power coupling, what were you before you became a caretaker? Engineer, pilot. Something like that. She paused. I held a position that required understanding many things, technologies, people. The consequences of choices made too quickly. Sounds bureaucratic and miserable. It was. The words came out sharp enough to cut. She softened immediately. I mean, it had its moments, but yes, mostly miserable. They lapsed into the easy rhythm of shared work, and Varek found himself talking again, this time about why he'd left the military. How he'd been offered a commission that would have meant enforcing colonial edicts on frontier worlds, extracting resources from people who had nothing left to give. How he'd chosen exile and poverty over complicity. My commanding officer said I was throwing away a future, he said, tightening a bolt. I told him some futures aren't worth having. That took courage. Lyraen's voice was quiet. Nah, just stubbornness and a pathological inability to follow orders I think are stupid. He grinned. The smuggling life suits me better anyway. Fewer rules, more explosions. Is that what you wanted? Explosions? Not specifically, but they keep happening. I'm starting to think I'm cursed. That evening, they ate together again. More of the preserved fruit and something Lyraen called travel bread that tasted like concentrated nostalgia for places Varek had never been. He made a joke about their domestic arrangement, calling her wife again, and she laughed but touched those golden markings on her arms with an expression he couldn't read. You do that a lot, he observed. Touch those designs when you're thinking. They're reminders. She pulled her sleeve down quickly, of who I was, who I tried to be. Heavy reminders for body art. Yes, they are. The next day, while searching for a specific tool, Varek found a sealed doorway he hadn't noticed before. The symbols around it pulsed with faint light, and when he touched them, they felt warm. Don't, Lyraen's voice came too late. The door opened soundlessly, revealing a chamber that had been perfectly preserved. Holographic murals sprang to life, covering every surface. They showed a woman with pointed ears and golden markings identical to Lyraen's, standing before fleets of ships that made his smuggling vessel look like a child's toy. The woman wore robes that seemed woven from starlight, and countless beings from species Varek recognized, and dozens he didn't knelt before a throne carved from something that looked like crystallized gravity. What is this? He asked, but he already knew. The sinking feeling in his gut told him everything. Lyraen stood in the doorway, backlit by the temple's ambient glow. Her expression held resignation and something that might have been relief. A history I was trying to forget, she said quietly. We should seal this, please. But Varek was staring at the murals, at the woman who looked exactly like his caretaker companion, at the symbols beneath the throne that his translator couldn't parse, but his instincts recognized as titles of power. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he desperately didn't want to see. Lyraen. Please, her voice cracked on the word. Not yet, just a little longer. He let her seal the chamber, watched the light die as the door closed. They stood in the corridor and the silence stretched between them like a gulf. The storms are coming back, she said finally. We should return inside. Varek looked up at the sky where distant lights had begun to appear in orbit. Not stars, ships, lots of them. Yeah, he said, I think we should. The ships didn't land so much as impose themselves upon reality. They emerged from quantum fold with the kind of precision that spoke of military discipline and resources Varek couldn't begin to calculate. The largest vessel bent light around its hull, creating a distortion that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on it directly. So, he said, watching the landing craft descend in perfect formation, I'm guessing those aren't here for me. Lyraen stood beside him in the temple courtyard, and she'd changed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. Her posture had shifted, straightened, until she seemed taller somehow. The casual warmth had drained from her expression, replaced by something carved from ice and duty. They found me, she said, and her voice carried harmonics it hadn't held before, layered, resonant, the kind of voice that gave orders to millions. I knew they would eventually. I'd hoped for more time. Time for what? To explain why you've got murals of yourself accepting worship from half the known galaxy. I wasn't accepting worship. I was accepting responsibility. She turned to him, and her eyes held depths he hadn't seen before. My name is Lyraen. That part was true, but my full title is Empress Lyraen Vas Solara, Sovereign of the Thousand Suns, Keeper of the Stellar Covenant, and approximately 40 other things I stopped paying attention to after the first decade. Varek's laugh came out strangled. You're joking, please tell me you're joking. I wish I were. The first landing craft touched down, and guards emerged wearing armor that seemed to absorb light. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of people who'd trained together for years, forming a perimeter with weapons that hummed at frequencies that made Varek's teeth ache. Stay close to me, Lyraen said quietly. They won't hurt you if I forbid it, but some of them can be overzealous. Oh good, I was worried this might get awkward. A figure emerged from the central craft, tall and imposing, with crystalline growths rising from their skull like a crown of frozen lightning. They moved toward Lyraen with purpose, and their expression cycled through relief, anger, and exasperation in rapid succession. Your radiance, they said, and their voice carried the weight of barely controlled frustration. 3 months. You've been gone for 3 months, while the sovereignty tears itself apart. Hello, Chancellor Torvin, Lyraen replied, and Varek heard weariness in every syllable. I see you brought the entire fleet, subtle as always. But subtlety seemed inadvisable when our Empress vanishes without explanation, leaving behind only a note saying she needed to think. Torvin's gaze slid to Varek with the kind of assessment usually reserved for particularly uninspiring insects. And you've acquired a human, wonderful. Commander Varek Cain, Lyraen said, and her voice took on that layered quality again. He crashed here. I offered shelter. He has been nothing but courteous. But how fortunate that your radiance had company during her unauthorized sabbatical, while the Caliph coalition prepared for war, and the threshold accords collapsed. More figures emerged from the landing craft, advisors, guards, what looked like a medical team. They swarmed around Lyraen with the practiced efficiency of people used to managing an empress, and Varek found himself pushed to the periphery. He watched her transform before his eyes, watched the woman who'd laughed at his terrible jokes become something remote and untouchable. A young officer approached him, face carefully neutral. Commander Cain, if you'll come with me, we'll process your compensation and arrange transport to your home system. Compensation for what? For inadvertently providing shelter to her radiance. Standard protocol for civilians who render aid. You'll be well compensated for your discretion. I'm being bribed to forget this happened. Think of it more as aggressive gratitude. The officer's smile didn't reach his eyes. Across the courtyard, Torvin was speaking rapidly to Lyraen in a language Varek's translator couldn't parse. Her responses were short, clipped, and her hands had fallen into gestures that spoke of command, sharp, decisive movements that cut through argument. Then her voice rose, cutting through the crowd noise with the kind of authority that made everyone freeze. Commander Cain showed me kindness when he had no reason to. He will be afforded every courtesy, every respect, and if anyone treats him as anything less than an honored guest, they will answer to me personally. Am I clear? The silence that followed could have cut glass. Your radiance, Torvin said carefully, we meant no disrespect, we simply thought. I know what you thought, you're wrong. She turned to Varek, and for just a moment he saw the woman from the temple, the one who'd bandaged his ribs and shared her food. Varek, I'm sorry. This isn't how I wanted you to find out. That you're an empress. Yeah, I can see how that might not come up in casual conversation. He was aiming for his usual flippancy, but it came out hollow. So what now? You go back to your throne and I get paid to pretend the last few days didn't happen. That would be the traditional approach, she said quietly. Right, traditional. He looked at the massive throne ship hanging in orbit, at the hundreds of attendants treating Lyraen like she was made of spun glass and divine mandate. For what it's worth, I preferred you as a caretaker. Something flickered in her expression, pain, maybe, or regret. So did I. Torvin cleared his throat. Your radiance, the preparations for your return ceremony require your attention. The throne ship awaits. Lyraen nodded, and just like that, she was the Empress again. Varek watched her walk away, surrounded by guards and advisors, and tried to reconcile the woman who'd laughed at his jokes with the figure who could reshape civilizations with a word. They dressed him in clothes that cost more than his ship had when it was new, which wasn't saying much but still felt absurd. The fabric adjusted to his body temperature and somehow made him look less like a smuggler and more like someone who'd wandered into the wrong royal function. Varek studied himself in a mirror that showed him from angles he didn't want to see and decided he looked ridiculous. The formal audience was scheduled for dawn, which gave him one night to sleep in quarters more luxurious than anywhere he'd ever lived. He didn't sleep. Instead, he stood at the window watching the throne ship eclipse stars and wondered what the hell he was supposed to say to an empress who'd once called him husband as a joke. When dawn came, they escorted him to the obsidian balcony where Lyraen used to watch the storms. She stood there now, wearing robes that caught starlight and refracted it into colors that hurt to name. The golden markings on her arms were visible now, glowing faintly, and he understood they weren't decorative at all. They were a burden made visible. A dozen advisors stood at respectful distances, far enough to give the illusion of privacy, but close enough to intervene if the primitive human said something inappropriate. Varek had built a career on saying inappropriate things, so their concern wasn't unfounded. "Commander Cain," Lyraen said, and her voice held all the formal weight of her position. "I wanted to thank you personally before your departure." "Right, the departure." He glanced at the waiting advisors. "You want to maybe dismiss the audience. I feel like I'm performing for critics." She hesitated, then made a gesture. The advisors withdrew, though their body language screamed reluctance. When they were alone, or as alone as an empress ever got, her shoulders dropped slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the deception, for not telling you." "Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly forthcoming about the illegal cargo I was running, so let's call it even." He moved to stand beside her at the railing. The throne ship hung above them like a small moon, and smaller vessels moved in patterns too precise to be anything but ceremony. "So this is it. You go back to being empress of everything, and I go back to being a guy who crashes into things. That would be the logical conclusion." "Logical, right?" He laughed, and it sounded bitter even to his own ears. "Can I ask you something? Those days in the temple, were they real or was I just entertainment for a bored royal?" Her head snapped toward him, and in her eyes he saw genuine hurt. "They were the most real thing I've experienced in years. Do you understand what it meant, having someone treat me as just another person? Someone who argued with me, made terrible jokes, called me wife without knowing it actually meant something." "Meant something how?" "In my culture, shared sustenance, shelter given, companionship sworn beneath stars, these are components of our marriage rites. Ancient ones, rarely invoked anymore but still legally binding." She touched the markings on her arms. "When you joked about being married, you were accidentally correct. By our oldest laws, we are betrothed unless formally dissolved." Varek felt the ground shift beneath him. "You're saying I accidentally proposed to an empress?" "Technically, I accepted your proposal by continuing to share meals with you. This is the most absurd thing that's ever happened to me, and I once got arrested for smuggling livestock that turned out to be sentient." She laughed, and it was the genuine sound from the temple, breaking through all the imperial formality. Then the laughter turned to something else, and she was crying, and Varek had no idea what to do except stand there uselessly. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. "I failed my people catastrophically, a first contact scenario that I rushed into, trying to prove I was worthy of this position. Millions died because I made assumptions, because I didn't listen, because I thought being empress meant having all the answers." She gestured at the throne ship. "Now I return to make more decisions that will doom more people, to be worshipped and feared and so utterly alone that some days I can barely breathe. So don't go back. I'm an empress, I don't have that luxury. No, you're a person who happens to be empress. There's a difference." Varek surprised himself with the words, with the conviction behind them. What happens if an empress chooses a consort from outside the traditional whatever? The noble houses or bloodlines or however your people do things. She stared at him. My advisors would revolt, the council would object. Half the sovereignty would see it as an insult to tradition. But could you do it, legally I mean? I'm the Empress. My word reshapes treaties and topples governments. Her voice was barely a whisper. But you don't understand what you'd be accepting. Constant scrutiny, political intrigue, the weight of billions of lives hanging on every decision. You'd hate it. Probably, he admitted, but I'd hate watching you walk away more. And maybe an empress who has someone to make terrible jokes and remind her she's human, or whatever your species is, might make fewer catastrophic decisions. Just a theory. You're insane. Yeah, that's been established. But I'm also apparently already married to you by accident, so we might as well make it official. He extended his hand, and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it. What do you say, wife? Want to scandalize an empire? She looked at his hand, then at the throne chip, then back at him. The advisors were returning, drawn by some sixth sense that something important was happening. Chancellor Torvin's expression suggested he'd calculated approximately 12,000 ways this could end badly. Lyraen reached out, her fingers touching his, and the golden markings on her arms blazed with light. Yes, she said simply. The advisors erupted in protest, but Lyraen's voice cut through them all with imperial authority. Commander Varek Cain is my chosen consort, acknowledged before witnesses under the ancient rites. Anyone who objects can file formal complaints, which I will ignore. We have a sovereignty to repair, and I'm done doing it alone. Varek looked at the woman who'd bandaged his ribs and shared her food, who'd laughed at his jokes and shown him ancient stars. She smiled at him, and for the first time since the fleet arrived, she looked genuinely happy. So, he said, do I get a crown, or just a really uncomfortable uniform? Both. Also, you'll need to learn diplomatic protocol, stellar law, and how to not start wars at state dinners. I make no promises about the war thing. She laughed, and somewhere above them, the throne ship waited to carry them both toward a future neither had planned, but both were choosing anyway.